Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating, from the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day. Each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Yet another great show. We have Robert Schoch coming on to talk about his new book, Forgotten Civilizations, but I have some announcements that I have to make that are very, very, very important. First is Just Energy Radio is looking at moving to a new radio carrier, so that might happen actually as quickly as a couple of weeks from now. And so I will announce it officially next week. I'll put information on the Just Energy Radio website. That's www.justenergyradio.com. And for the people that listen via Blog Talk, I will post that information there as well, where you can continue listening to Just Energy Radio. Also, I just turned in the proof copy or the final draft of Man-Made, the Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, to the printer, and I'm waiting very patiently, okay, not so patiently, for the proof copy to come back. I mean, literally that happened like an hour ago. So, but you can pre-order your copy by going to Man-Made, the Chronicles, get free shipping, signed by myself and my co-author, Wayne Law Liberty. Priceless. And as always, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And, please do sign up for our weekly newsletter. You can do that at the Just Energy Radio webpage. That's www.justenergyradio.com. You can access our archives there, too. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about this week's guest, Robert Schoch. Dr. Robert Schoch is a full-time faculty member at the College of General Studies at Boston University since 1984. He earned his Ph.D. in geology and geophysics at Yale University. Dr. Schoch has been quoted extensively in the media for his pioneering research recasting the date of the Great Sphinx of Egypt using geological analysis, as well as for his work on ancient cultures and monuments in such diverse countries as Peru, Bosnia, and Japan. So the author of the new book, Forgotten Civilizations, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future, Dr. Robert Schoch. Hey, Robert, how are you?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
I am so glad to have you back on.
I'm glad to be back on.
One of the things that I think is very cool, you're going to be going with a good friend of mine and good friend of Just Energy Radio, Brian Forrester, to Easter Island. I'm so jealous of you.
I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, we're going in November. It'll be over the week of Thanksgiving, which I'm hoping is a good week for many people because it's a time when lots of people, they can take off and, have some free time there. It's a beautiful island. I mean, people who have not been to Easter Island, they really need to think about going. Anyone who has been there knows how wonderful it is, and maybe they want to join us and go again.
One of the things that I kind of feel, because it has not been run over by, I'm going to say, tourists, I bet it really still has that old feel to it?
It does. It does. It has a very old feel to it, and this is actually something that Brian and I will be looking at specifically, as we're taking people around and having a good time. The current standard archaeological historical explanation about Easter Island is that Polynesians got there a mere maybe 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, which is not very long geologically, that they were isolated there, that they then developed their own sort of subculture. What Easter Island is known for, just to remind people, are the huge heads, the huge stone volcanic heads. I mean, these things are, multi-ton. They stand 30 feet or more high. And there's different sized ones. So the moai, the huge heads, it's known for that. It's known for things like the Rongo script, this mysterious script. It's known for the petroglyphs. So it's got all these mysteries. In fact, in some ways, it's the epitome of mysteries. But I wanted to get back to the dating. I believe, based on my work, and I'm going to explore this further when I get back there, that the moai and the culture of Easter Island actually goes back thousands and thousands of years earlier. We've seen how archaeologists have been wrong in the past. I think this is another case where they've misstated it to a much younger period. So I think we have a really ancient culture there, and it survived intact, and it survived basically undisturbed until 1722, when the Europeans, we'll call it the modern Europeans, the Dutch in particular, found the island, and they first found it on Easter Sunday, so that's why it's called Easter Island.
And I have a couple of questions about the moai, but I just have to tell you, I remember, when I was in high school, maybe not even that old, seeing those heads, and to be honest, I can't, remember if it came out of an Eric von Däniken book or National Geographic, but I just remember this, full-color plate and my mouth and eyes going, huh?
Exactly. I mean, the moai, the huge moai, these heads and torsos, and that's what they are. They don't have legs, except for one in particular, and that's kneeling. That's totally anomalous compared to the others. There are these heads, this torsos. They've got these stylistic arms that go down and hold sort of the belly navel region. They have these elongated faces. They are looking up to the sky. Some of them wear what are top knots or hats, which are different red volcanic rock. They're really strange. They're really interesting. They're one of the great enigmas of the ancient world. Some people actually use them as a symbol of, mystery and, things that we don't understand. I mean, they're absolutely amazing. So I encourage anyone to come with us, and we will be exploring and discussing them together.
One of the things that I didn't realize until Brian Forrester started bringing this material forward on Facebook, of all places, was that you see the picture of the ones that are standing by the ocean's edge, and you can see that there's a full body, but you were led to believe for years that they were just a bunch of heads. But it turns out that they actually are buried in the ground. Yeah, there are a number. Well, now let me clarify geologically. There are a number around the quarry. It's one section of the island. It's a very small island. If you're stout and fit, you could walk around the entire perimeter of the island in just 2 days or so. I mean, it's a very small island, so it's been very isolated. It's just really interesting on so many levels. Yet it's very small, but it has literally thousands and thousands of archaeological sites that have been dubbed archaeological sites. There's hundreds of these moai. We're not talking just a few. And the ones in one region are where they were erected, but then they were filled in with sediment. Sediment surrounded them, covered them over, up to their chins, up to their necks in some cases. You're talking 5 to 6 meters worth of sediment filling them in. And what is very interesting, and this is something I'm going to look at further when I'm there with Brian and also Hugh Newman of Megalithomania, some people may know him,
or know of him. The three of us are going to be working there together, and my wife Katie will be joining us. She'll be with us too. And she's actually been very instrumental in a lot of the Easter Island Rongo script. I like to give credit where it's due, especially to my wife. But what we have are these heads that have been buried in sediment, but I want to be clear that they were not digging holes and just sticking them in and then filling them up. I am convinced geologically that these were naturally buried, more or less the layers of sediment slowly accumulated around them, and it was not a matter, as some people have suggested, for the most part at least, it was not a matter of tsunamis or landslides, that type of thing, because that would frankly knock them over. They're very tall proportionally relative to their size, and I believe in some cases, in many cases, they were filled in naturally with sediment. So to accumulate meters and meters of sediment, you don't do that in just a few centuries or even just a few millennia, and this is one of the aspects I'm going to be looking at, what exactly is happening with them geologically. I believe it's going to be the same case. I already believe we have evidence that it's the same case as with my work in Egypt on the Great Sphinx, where that was dated to about 2500 BC, which is older than the archaeologists are saying for Easter Island, the standard archaeologists, but that was the Great Sphinx was dated to 2500 BC by the classical Egyptologists. The geological evidence, which I have been working on for over 20 years now, and it has not been refuted. I've only found more confirming evidence, and then corroborative evidence in other places like Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, which I think we'll have a chance to talk about, indicates that the Sphinx goes back thousands of years earlier. I think we have exactly the same situation in Easter Island.
I'm glad that you were talking about, I want to go back to Easter Island, but we'll talk about the Sphinx in a section.
Oh, yeah. We'll get to that.
We have so much to talk about.
I know.
I'm really glad. I mean, that was one of the questions that I wondered was, were they intentionally buried, or was it this process of them just, being surrounded by dirt? Because
I think it's, from my point of view, geologically, they were surrounded by dirt. It was slowly built up over time, and so this is an important key. It's not that they were digging holes and sticking them down in the holes.
From listening to you talk, it sounds like when you were there the last time, you didn't have an opportunity to really dig into, no pun intended, the strata, the rock strata and the dirt.
No, I haven't, but I do want to say that I was not there to excavate last time, and to excavate takes a long time and energy, and frankly, I'm glad to let other people do that when they feel like doing it. There have been excavations recently since I was last there. I was there in 2010. Katie and I were married there. We decided to get married when we were there. I mean, we were going to get married anyway, but we were married there, even though we've been together much longer. And at that time, there were no moai that were excavated, more or less recently excavated, but moai have in fact been excavated in the past. A lot of people don't realize this. Catherine Rutledge, who studied the moai and spent a number of weeks, actually months, on Easter Island in the early 20th century, about 100 years ago now, not quite 100 years ago, but the early part of the 20th century, she excavated some moai and demonstrated how the ones that were filled up, are covered up, I should say, up to their chins, had the full body and torso underneath. Thor Heyerdahl, when he was there in the middle 20th century, also excavated some and demonstrated the same thing. So even prior to this upcoming trip in November, I've had a chance to study those reports carefully, to look at what they uncovered as far as the stratigraphy, the layers of rock, how the sediment had formed based on their photographs, that type of thing. So I've already got a handle on that, but it's going to be very interesting now to look at the recent excavations that have been done just in the past few months to year or so.
That's great.
Yeah,
so it sounds like you'll get access to them.
Yeah, I believe so. I don't think there'll be any problem. We'll be able to see a lot because a lot of them, they're there. They can't really stop you, as far as I understand, from where they've been excavating them. And already I've been able to look again, with my geological eye at photographs that are being published on the internet, etc. Because, there are certain things that people focus on the statues in many cases. Yes, they're very important. But for me as a geologist, I also focus on the sediment that's been excavated around and what that tells me. So
that just makes me smile. It's like, well, I don't look at the statues. I just look at the rocks.
Yeah, I know. It's a funny thing.
One of the things that I find interesting in the ones that they have excavated recently is that there's actually carvings. You can see the hands. I remember one image.
Yeah.
It looked like it had like a little G-string on. I'm like,
yeah, a little G-string type thing. They've got hands. They have very interesting fingers when you look at the length of the fingers and the thumbs, that type of thing. It's been suggested what you may have there in part is elongated fingers or fingers with very long fingernails on them, something like that. But the positioning of the hands, the positioning of the arms, the positioning of the thumbs, the way the hands sort of wrap around the belly and the sort of frame the navel area, it's all very interesting, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But it's incredibly interesting that you have the same motifs, the same positioning, the same, I'll call it sort of pattern in Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey at 9 to 10,000 BC. So,
are you talking about that one kind of white-colored statue that they found that has the hands kind of resting in the navel area also?
Yeah, well, what you're referring to is, it's sometimes known as Urfaman. It's a somewhat larger than lifestyle statue. I have a picture of it in the color section of Forgotten Civilization in the color insert, and I'm standing next to it for scale. There's that statue, but also some of the monolithic pillars at the site of Gobekli Tepe itself. Just to familiarize people with it, Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is a number of stone circles. I'll call it stone circles, sort of Stonehenge-like. And instead of one, there's been 4 that have been excavated so far. Most of them, 4 that have been, let me put it this way, 4 that the majority of those stone circles have been excavated is the way I should put it, because they're still excavating those 4 stone circles. There's another 18 or 20 under the ground somewhere in that range that have been found through geophysical methods. So it's a huge complex. These are huge monolithic stone structures. Single stones are weighing 10 to 15 tons, 5 meters or more tall for the largest ones. So again, does this sound familiar? It's not unlike in some ways Stonehenge. It's not unlike in many ways the Moai on Easter Island. And it's very like the Moai on Easter Island in the sense that you get the same positioning of the arms and the hands, because some of the monoliths at Gobekli Tepe are humanoid. They're anthropomorphic. They don't have well-distinguished heads. They sort of have a T shape on the top that clearly represents the head, but there's no eyes, there's no mouth, that type of thing. But they have very well-carved hands. They have very well-carved arms. One of them actually has a beautiful belt. It sort of looks like a designer belt. But I'm convinced that there are a lot of motifs and similarities, which I have a hard time finding could be just coincidental. It's hard to believe they could just be coincidental, but similarities between Gobekli Tepe, amazingly enough, and Easter Island. Maybe there was a common cultural heritage, maybe there was a common influence on both. I don't know at this point, but I think it's intriguing.
Well, I mean, especially with Easter Island being out in the middle of
middle of nowhere. It's sometimes said that Easter Island is the most remote inhabited area in the world. It's not absolutely the most remote area in the world, but the most remote inhabited area in the world. And this ties in with another thing. At the end of the last ice age, I believe Easter Island would have been larger. I mean, not huge. It wasn't a continent or anything, but it would have been larger. It got smaller, as is logical if you think about, with the rising sea levels after the glaciers melted, so after the last ice age ended. And I am speculating right now that it was inhabited at a very early age. It was very remote, and it essentially retained a culture, it retained a heritage right up until the 18th century that was this ancient heritage. And there was a continuity there that you really did not have at any other place on Earth, any other site on Earth. So it's very interesting and I believe very important from many points of view. All the more reason people should join the tour.
Yeah. And actually, let's just put this out there at this point in time. If they want to get more information about it, where would they go get more information, sign up?
The easiest thing for them to do is to go to my website, my personal website, which is www.robertschoch, it's all one word, spelled RobertSchoch.com. Just to clarify, my last name is Robert Schoch. Many people know that, but then they want to misspell and put a K on the end. So it's SCHOCH, and it's all one word, www.robertschoch, all one word, again, RobertSchoch.com. If they go there, they will see on the front page, the first page, right on the left side, they'll see a Sphinx, and they'll see on the left side a place where they can click, and it will take them right to the Easter Island information. It says, I think, Megalithomania or whatnot, because it's actually being sponsored by Megalithomania, and the founding member of that, the force behind that, is a wonderful fellow, Hugh Newman, who will be traveling with Brian Forrester and I to Easter Island.
I mean, we've had Hugh on the show a couple of times. Just fascinating guy.
Oh, yeah, he's great. Well, he's actually, I don't know if he's still in the United States at the moment. He's from England. He was in the United States. I think he's still here. Yeah, he's still traveling around the United States, but Katie and I had, lunch or something like that not long ago. He would pass through the Boston area. Yeah, he's a great guy.
Fun. With the culture on Easter Island, and I'm just kind of throwing a long shot at you, and I know it's not your area, and you probably will be like, you'll probably dismiss me, but I'm just going to throw it.
No.
There's the whole idea of the lost continent, Mu.
Yeah.
Would having that culture be there tend to lend any kind of credence to that myth?
Well, that's a hard thing to say, and I'm not trying to evade or just be diplomatic. Mu, lost continent of Mu, is sort of like lost continent of Atlantis to me, more or less. Is it a literal lost continent? Is it more representative of a lost culture? That type of thing. Let's take for a second the consideration that we don't need to worry about whether it's a literal continent or not, but that there's this very early culture back into the end of the last ice age. I think there absolutely was. I think we have lots of evidence now for, I'll call it high civilization during the end of the last ice age. We can call that Mu. If we're talking the Pacific realm, we can call it Atlantis, Plato's Atlantis, if we're talking the Old World realm. So in that sense, I think, yes, it's support for it. And that ties in with what I was talking about, that I believe we have on Easter Island the remains, when I say remains, the continuity of this very, very ancient culture, very different. I don't believe it was necessarily just a Polynesian culture, more or less not just Polynesians that eventually hit Easter Island. It may have actually worked the other way around. There may have been very ancient culture on Easter Island that later spread to Polynesia, later spread to South America. We'll talk about this when we're there on the island and give real examples, but I believe there are cultural connections between Easter Island and mainland South America as well as with Polynesia. part of the problem with Easter Island, and it's a very, very sad thing, is that we would know so much more about the culture of Easter Island if things had been different in the 18th and 19th century. The Europeans, as has happened so often, came to Easter Island. They essentially raided Easter Island in metaphorical and literal senses. They killed a number of the inhabitants that were there when they found the island in 1722. They literally raided it for slaves to use back in South America. I mean, it was just a horrible thing, the way the culture that was there was devastated in modern times, and a lot was lost. So slowly we're trying to reconstruct. People are trying to reconstruct exactly what Easter Island culture was originally. And it's a little disconcerting to me, too, because then sometimes people make assumptions which aren't good assumptions, and those assumptions, I think, lead us astray to just assume that it was a Polynesian culture and that's all there is to it. So I guess my answer to your question is there's a lot of evidence there that something goes much further back, and that could tie in with the general concept of a much more ancient culture that people have used the term Mu for.
You're talking about what happened on Easter Island, and they're not the only people, obviously, that have been...
Not at all.
And, people point to, the burning of the Library of Alexandria as the giant loss of knowledge and information, but, between the 1500s and modern times, what Western civilization has done to all of these, primitive and remote cultures, I think is just as bad because we've lost as much, if not more, information.
Yeah, exactly. In these remote cultures, I would, and not to pick up on what you're saying or to counter what you're saying, but you used the term, which is a common term, colloquial term, primitive culture. The Dutch and the Europeans, when they first started going back and forth to Easter Island after it was discovered, so in the 18th and 19th century, they considered these primitive people. And I would argue, that was the concept, that these were primitive people. What I would say is they were really quite different. I don't think there was anything primitive about them. It's certainly not at the height of their culture, building these huge megalithic stone structures, moving them around, moving the moai around. They had a very complex, apparently, writing system. It's called the Rongo script, and it's really a hieroglyphic text, if you would, that was carved on stone, carved on wooden tablets, and getting back to the concept of destruction. They hid this from the Europeans for some time after the Europeans had discovered the island, but then the Europeans found out about it in the 19th century, these Rongo texts, and incredible numbers apparently were destroyed. They were burnt. At that point, the culture was collapsing. Different clans were warring with each other. There was just a lot of internal destruction. The Europeans, of course, I shouldn't say of course, but this is what happened historically, were trying to Christianize the natives. So we saw once again that anything that was considered non-Christian, that could be considered, quote, heathen, unquote, was being burnt, was being destroyed. We had the same thing in Mesoamerica and South America with the books, the codices that were destroyed. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's just the same cycle over and over, destroying things and destroying cultures, primitive or advanced, that are unlike the culture of the invaders, in this case Europeans.
Mm-hmm. It's just sad.
It's very sad, and what's really sad, I think, getting back to what we're discussing, is how much information was lost.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's the saddest part.
That's a really sad part. And then getting back to forgotten civilization and solar outbursts, and this is something that my wife, Katie, gets credit for, and I can explain this in detail. It will sound strange maybe to just say it initially, but I believe that the Rongo texts that are on Easter Island, most of which were destroyed, I believe that they may be a major key as to what happened at the end of the last ice age. I believe that the oldest Rongo texts actually record the solar outburst, a major solar event at the end of the last ice age that caused the demise of the end of the last ice age, caused the climatic changes, the great climatic changes and cataclysms that we know occurred geologically, and also affected the very early civilizations of the time. So it's a loss on many, many levels.
Have they had any luck in deciphering the Rongo? I know that they've tried and they've had people come up with, this is what it says.
Okay. Well, so this leads right leads right into one of the themes of Forgotten Civilization, my new book. So I have to back up a little bit. I am convinced at this point, based on numerous lines of evidence, that there was a major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age. Unlike anything that we've seen in historical times, unlike anything that we've had for the last 8,000 to 10,000 years, even going back that far in time. People may have heard about, they may be aware of, because it's making even national news now, that we're having major solar flares. They're what are known as coronal mass ejections, when there are major spewing of electrical particles, charged particles, protons, electrons, that type of thing. Basically, big bubbles of gas, if you wish. Not technically gas, it's electrical plasma, electrically and magnetically charged particles coming out of the sun. If those hit us, when they hit us, it causes all kinds of devastation on Earth. One hit us in 1859. It's known as the Carrington event, knocked out the telegraph systems of the time. We've had smaller ones hit us in more recent times, and we could talk about that more in the effects. On a cycle of maybe every 10 to 12,000 years, the sun undergoes major disruptions, spews out incredible amounts of plasma, has these huge coronal mass ejections, huge solar flares. And there's a fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory who has studied this for many years and has looked at this, and he's a plasma physicist. His name is Dr. Anthony Perrott, and he has been studying this for years. He started by studying it, from stars, from an astronomical perspective, and modeling it with these supercomputers they have. And what he's found is when you have these major discharges and they hit the atmosphere of Earth, they form what we could think of as a aurora borealis, the northern and southern lights. People are familiar with that. And they form specific formations. He calls them plasma columns, but what they look like are sort of dancing stick figures. They take on characteristic forms, sort of shapes of donuts, that type of thing. This is just descriptively describing them. Even in 1859, that was a fairly small solar outburst, people described seeing this in the sky. What Dr. Perrott found is that there are these ancient engravings found all around the world on rocks. They're known as petroglyphs, and they don't really look like humans. They don't look anatomically correct. They're very strange looking. There's other strange shapes. They go back well into prehistory. You couldn't date most of them, know exactly how old they are, but they all look like they are indicative of these weird things in the sky. In fact, they all have the correct orientation when you find them in the field for the direction you would have to look if there was a major solar outburst hitting the Earth, and you would see these things in the sky. So he made the prediction, or he came to the conclusion, that there must have been, as he calls it, a major solar outburst in prehistory. Now, getting back to Easter Island, we were studying this. I was familiar with Dr. Perrott's work. We go to Easter Island, Katie and myself, on an exploratory trip there. We're studying the moai. We're studying the art on Easter Island, including petroglyphs, which Dr. Peratt has also pointed out look like these types of structures. And then we start studying the Rongo script that you were asking about, which no one to this day has been able to decipher definitively. There's been a lot of different theories about it. Some people have said that the Rongo script is nothing more than the primitive Easter Islanders. They saw Europeans writing, so it's like they were little kids. They decided to try to imitate what the Europeans were doing, which is really degrading to them, frankly.
It's insulting. If you could see the look on my face,
Yeah, it's totally insulting, but, these are modern scholars saying this. I can't believe it. I mean, if you look at the Rongo, it's not primitive. It's quite sophisticated. Other people have said, it's some kind of pictographic script. Other people have literally suggested that maybe it's just decorative. Maybe these are just decorative borders on pieces of wood that they put in their primitive, dwellings or something. Some of the theories were just ludicrous. Some of the more cogent theories actually were that they're procreation chants along the lines of something copulates with something else, something interacts with something else to give rise to something else, like fish copulate with the moon to form the sun. I'm just making that up, but along those lines, that they were essentially procreation chants. What Katie suggested to me, because we were watching a video put out, if people know about the Electric Universe, that's another group that is doing some cutting-edge research, and we were watching a video about that just to relax. It mentioned Dr. Peratt's work, the Los Alamos plasma physicist. I had been familiar with his work. I'd read his technical papers before, and she says to me, what he's talking about, those petroglyphs, look sort of like the Rongo script. And immediately I say, yeah, they do. And then when we start analyzing it, what we've come to conclude is that the Rongo, at least in its incipient form, its initial form, I think was actually a very detailed record of what was happening in the sky during a major solar outburst. And the last time there was such a major solar outburst was at the end of the last ice age, and that's been confirmed by ice core, isotopic data, sediment core, isotopic data, a whole slew of scientific data that the Earth was subjected to a major solar event at the end of the last ice age. So I think there's a very important key there. I think this is now a breakthrough as to what the Rongo script indicates. And we haven't been able to interpret every little element of it yet, and that remains to be done, but I think we've got a breakthrough key here. It doesn't mean that script couldn't have been used for more mundane things in later forms. Just as something's developed for one purpose, it may then be applied to other purposes later. But that's my working theory on the Rongo at the moment.
That's really interesting, and I just can't wait till they figure it out, but I'm glad they're taking their time in trying to assess it as opposed to going, oh, it means this.
Yeah, exactly, because just to say it means this or that, it really gets strange. But I think it's very important, it's very key. I think it has something to do with, these events deep in time, long ago, and also could be of practical importance because we may be looking at a major solar event in the not-too-distant future.
And when you see text like that, all right, this is my belief. This is one of the conclusions that I came to, was that, text like that, or even like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it was kind of like a manual or documenting something that became dogmatized.
Right, exactly.
And then, they just said, oh, well, you have to have this thing.
Right. Yeah, a lot of things they start out one way and then they sort of become dogmatic another way, and then they take on different meanings, and then people forget the original meaning of it. So, yeah, and it gets all convoluted, should we say.
Right. But Speaking of the Book of the Dead, let's shift our focus over to Egypt for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've done all of your work there, and I'm just going to give you a chance to kind of pitch, because you were telling me before we went on air that you're going to be doing something in Egypt.
I'm going to be doing something in Egypt too. Yeah, I'm very busy. I will be going to Egypt in December. I will be doing this. I'm very interested in going there. Katie and I are going there, and we are taking a group of people with us. So we've turned it into a tour that people can sign up for and go along for the trip. We're going to have a great time. We'll take a Nile cruise, et cetera, see all the major sites. We'll go from Cairo down to Aswan. And if people have never been to Egypt, you have to go to Egypt to get an understanding of the ancient world. Egypt is, just like Easter Island is sort of a world unto itself, Egypt is very much a world unto itself. So I'm very excited about that. We will be there for 3 important dates, which have made a lot of news recently, specifically, one of them specifically, and that's the winter solstice 2012. And many people are familiar with the winter solstice, December 21st, 2012, because based on the most common correlation of the Mayan calendar, that's when the Mayan calendar ends or turns over, however you want to put it. And there's been, a lot of talk about that for years now, what is going to happen on December 21st, 2012, if anything. What does it signify? What does it mean? And if I'm going to take my chances, I'd rather be in Egypt than anywhere else.
I'll tell you what, I think Egypt's going to be a pretty crowded place. You're the third person that it has an event going on for that weekend.
I know. Other people are. In fact, I think we're going to try to coordinate them a little bit. I'll see some of these people that have events. There's something called CPAC, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, in Palm Springs in early October. And I'll be speaking there. Some of them will be speaking there. We all know each other, put it that way. So, Egypt's going to be great. We specifically, I and my colleagues, Gregory Poplawski, who is a very good friend of mine, he's Polish. So he and I have organized this trip together, and we've traveled together in other trips. We were in Turkey for about 4 weeks cumulatively together this past summer. We're planning this, so we'll be in Egypt. We're going to be in the Great Pyramid. We're going to visit my beloved Sphinx. We'll have, really time with these. The Polish, it's interesting, the Polish generally have very good relations with Egypt. I've certainly had a lot of contacts with Egypt over time, too. And we've been able to arrange, for our own private time around the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, that type of thing. We're also going to go to Hawara, where most people don't go, which is in the Fayum region. And what's important there, especially with the 2012 date, is that is the site of the huge labyrinth, the fabled labyrinth. And you can still see remains of it on the surface. And many people have tied this in with 2012, that this may be another, should we say, I don't like the term necessarily, but Hall of Records, sometimes people refer to it, or a place where information is recorded from a much earlier civilization that might be useful as we go forward. So we'll be discovering that. We'll be discussing it. There's a lot of dispute over it, but I've been there before, and I'm absolutely convinced it's there. There's new radar, ground-penetrating radar data that we'll have a chance to discuss that indicates it's clearly there. So that's very exciting. And we'll be there over Christmas. We'll be there over New Year's. I also wanted to mention, a lot of people are asking me about Egypt. Is it safe to travel in Egypt? And
thank you.
Yeah, there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees in life. But I've been to Egypt numerous times over the last 22 years now, and I just don't have any qualms going to Egypt at this point. I've been following all the news. I've got personal contacts there. My colleague, whom I just mentioned, Gregory, just got back from Egypt once again. We were in Turkey together. I had to come back to the United States to teach my classes at Boston University. He went on to Egypt and spent a couple of weeks there just to make sure, checking everything out. He went right into Tahrir Square, etc. And, yes, there are demonstrations. Yes, there are things happening, but you just have to be a little bit smart about things and not be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's sort of obvious common sense. In America here, we're having demonstrations, in certain cities over teacher unions or whatever it may be. But on the whole, I feel safer in Egypt than I do in, sorry to say, many large American cities in certain areas of the city.
Well, and I think that if you're used to living in a metropolitan American city, and you have your little, mugger radar on. I mean, I grew up in New York City. It's kind of like, sorry, you put me in a downtown area at night, and I'm like, got my little radar on. I was born in D.C. My wife, Katie, she lived in New York for 20-some years. And, it's what you're used to and what, you take proper precautions. I don't take risks, certainly not when I have a group with me, but Egypt's safe as far as I'm concerned. And we are not going to go down to the middle of Tahrir Square to, take part in a demonstration or something. That's not safe. That's not safe if you're Egyptian. That's not safe for anyone. But my colleague, some people may know him, John Anthony West. Yeah.
He was in Egypt. He arrived a day or two before the revolution in Egypt. And the revolution actually happened while he was there with a group of people. And he said it was, it was incredible for him in a very, very positive sense because everyone got excited. All the tourists got excited. Everyone rushes to the Cairo airport, so there's mass confusion. They all want to leave. They're all, worried that, the world is going to end or something. And he took the opposite approach. He, as I do, have lots of contacts in Egypt. We know a lot of the same people in Egypt, actually. So he got hold of his contacts, got the real story of what was going on, went down to middle and upper Egypt, so down south, they found that they were now at these sites that are normally flooded with tourists. Everyone had evacuated. The Egyptians are as friendly as can be, and they just had the most incredible time. And everything was fine.
Carmen Bolder related a similar experience. She took a group right after the revolution. She goes, all of the places you would want to go were empty of tourists. She was it was like heaven.
Yeah, exactly. I actually had the same experience. This is going back in time. It dates me, but it shows how often I've been to Egypt and, over the years. In my early career with this, remember the first Iraq War under the first Bush and Kuwait and all that type of thing?
Mm-hmm.
And everyone got excited. So no one wants to go to that part of the world, including Egypt. I went to Egypt, and it was incredible because, it was as safe as could be, frankly. No one was attacking Egypt. And everything, again, was cleared out. There weren't mobs of tourists everywhere. I was able to study things on my own terms with no one bothering me. It was great.
That's like going to Disneyland on a rainy day.
Yeah, there you go. So actually,
but better.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, obviously, there's no guarantees in life, as they say, but I feel very comfortable going there. I would not go there if I thought there was any danger. Well, let me back up. I would not take a group there if I thought there was any danger. Honestly, I'll take more risk with myself alone, but I would not take a group there. I would not take Katie, my wife, there if I thought there was any danger. And we're very excited about it, and we have no hesitation whatsoever at the moment.
Excellent. And I'm just going to throw a little plug in since we're talking about December 21st, 2012. Here on Just Energy Radio, we're doing a show that I'm calling What Were You Doing While the World Was Coming to an End?
Mm-hmm.
And, we're asking the listeners if you want to call in and share your stories about what you were doing or not doing, as the case may be, or, your neighbor that stocked up 10 cases of beans or whatever. It's just a day for us to have some fun and reflect and let go of the fear that people have had about what may or may not happen, as the case may be.
I think that's really good. I think that's excellent. See, that's what I plan to do with the group. The people that travel with me to Egypt, we'll be doing that on the Giza Plateau on that day. So, yeah, we'll be thinking of you and vice versa.
Well, okay. Yay.
Yeah. We'll connect telepathically. I'm serious. Why not?
Okay.
Yeah, we should try it.
Well, actually, I need to kind of move forward on this. Carrie Cassidy apparently is going to be in Egypt at that point, and she apparently is looking at connecting a number of different shows in different time zones to do this 24-hour broadcast on that day.
Wow.
And so I might be part of that whole
that would
thing.
be great.
Yeah.
That would be great. I can't remember if she contacted me. I remember hearing something about this. That would be great.
So I'm excited.
Maybe we'll all be connected. Through the power of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, through the power of technology. But we won't go into telepathy right now. But I have no doubt about it. That works too. But it's not quite as efficient sometimes as the technology.
Well, I think if people learned how to use it better or access it better, it could be. And even better because it's
I think so. And I think that goes back, sometimes people ask me about the ancient civilizations, and I talk about this a little bit, forgotten civilization, I think in the last chapter or so. They were not necessarily doing what we're doing, which doesn't mean they were any more primitive or less primitive. They were different, is the way I like to put it. But I think many of the ancient civilizations, including the Egyptians and even the civilizations before that, they were much more sophisticated in such things that a lot of modern society, we're so technologically based, and we put more emphasis there, if I could put it that way. So, yeah, they're all important.
It's all important. I'm looking at the clock. We have about 7 minutes before we need to go to break, so I'm going, okay, let's see, where can we go and make an easy stop? Let's go back to talking about the Sphinx real quick.
Okay.
One of the things, you did your work and redated the building of the Sphinx.
Correct.
But, this question came to me, and I'm just going to throw it out at you. When you see images that come from, the 1800s, or even pictures that were drawn when Napoleon went to Egypt, and you would just see the head of the Sphinx.
Oh, yeah.
And you didn't see the body. How long do you think it would take for that complex area to fill in so that you just saw the head? We were talking about the dirt filling in on Easter Island. Would it be a similar process?
No. Actually, it's a very good question, and the answer is that the very different things are happening on Easter Island and what's happening in Egypt. What you have to remember is that the Sphinx, and this ties in with my redating, the Sphinx is sitting on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It sits on the eastern edge of the Sahara Desert. There's literally, when you go to Giza, and people that come with us on the trip to Egypt, if they haven't been there before, they're often surprised. People will see this. The Sphinx itself sits in an enclosure or a quarry or a ditch, it's called by different things, to carve the body of the Sphinx. They literally they chiseled down into the bedrock. They chiseled down into the limestone that forms the Giza Plateau. So only the head initially stood above the ground level, the original ground level. So they carved the body. When they carved the body, and a lot of people don't realize this, and it's an important point, they didn't just chip away the stone and, sort of scoop it out with shovels, that type of thing. They actually carved huge megaton stone blocks. We're talking stone blocks that weigh in the tens of tons. They carved those out to free up the body. They moved those blocks just east of the Sphinx and constructed what is known as the Sphinx Temple. So that just gives you the picture of what's there. So the Sphinx actually sits in a ditch or an enclosure. Now, when the Sahara winds blow, there's all this sand. I mean, it's a very sandy desert. It blows sand into the enclosure. And if the enclosure is not swept out on a regular basis, it fills in incredibly quickly, just in a matter of decades, literally. So that's what's happening at the Sphinx. It's a very different situation than you normally have. Normally, you would not fill a structure like that in so quickly, but here you have all the right conditions. It sits below ground level. There's sand to the west that blows in, so it blows in and it fills up very quickly. Very different than what we see on Easter Island, where you don't have a desert to blow in sand, where you build up slow soil accumulation over thousands and thousands of years. So they're two different situations.
I'm going to throw something out that, my little intuitive brain just got this little flash. Your dating really relies on the fact that there was water in the area and that it wasn't a desert at that point in time. Yeah. And, it would make more sense that they would build something that was below ground, because who wants to, as somebody posted in the chat room, sweep it out every day to keep the sand out? Oh, yeah, because, see, you didn't have that situation in pre-desert times. Exactly. That's a very good point. And we know that the Sahara Desert is, from a geological point of view, a young desert. It only goes back about 5,000 or so years. And before that, it was a much moister climate, much different environment. And to build something like that, you wouldn't have to sweep it out. It would not fill up so quickly. It's only in Sahara times, from the last 5,000 years or so, that it would fill up so quickly. And there's a record in dynastic times of it filling up, of it being dug back out, filling up again. So, this was happening in dynastic times, but it makes absolutely no sense to have constructed that way initially. And so I think it's a very good point, and it ties right in, I believe, helps confirm, that goes back to a much earlier period. I'm sure historians just go, that's because they were stupid.
Well, no, the interesting thing, and I want to elaborate on that point for 30 seconds, and I think we have to go to our break. It's amazing to me that professional Egyptologists devote their lives to studying ancient Egypt, yet they are always putting them down, if I could put it that way. Professional Egyptologists tend to think of ancient Egyptians as sort of, they're adroit at building big structures. They had the skill to make beautiful coffins and jewelry. But, overall, these were really stupid, primitive people, and we're so much better than they are. Well, why would you devote your life to studying someone just to put them down, to just say they're stupid and primitive?
But they were anything but stupid and primitive.
They were anything but. Yet the professional Egyptologists as a whole, they have this bias that somehow they're better than the people they're studying. And I think they've reversed it. I think we have so much to learn from the ancient Egyptians or many other ancient people.
I heard this interview, and I don't remember where it was. It might have been on Coast to Coast, but no, Actually, it wasn't. And it made me laugh, but it falls into this whole thing. And they were talking about the possibility of life on Titan. One of Uranus is
one of the moons.
One of the moons, the ones that's covered with ice, and they believe that there's water underneath. And the individual actually said, and I just was like, you got to be kidding me, that there couldn't be intelligent life there, because how could they develop electronics and transmit a signal underwater?
That's ridiculous.
Well, I know, and I just was like, you have got to be kidding me. There are other things that people maybe could do.
Yes. Some people are so narrow-minded, and if it isn't like them, and a people or a life form doesn't think and have the same values as them and use the same technology as them, it's just out of their realm. It's out of their worldview. They can't even think about it. I don't know.
I don't know, but the music's going to be coming up. See, that was perfect timing.
Okay.
Yay! Okay, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Robert Schoch about his new book, Forgotten Civilization. His website is robertschoch.com, and we'll be back with him after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
Move past the crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationships, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, the founder of the Institute of Applied Energetics. Start a new career today on the leading edge of alternative health and healing. The Institute of Applied Energetics can help you to develop the specialized skills you'll need to work as an energy medicine practitioner, intuitive counselor, or professional medical intuitive. Besides our outstanding technical instruction, our programs also support you in creating and building a successful business in this rapidly growing field. Be a catalyst for changing the way healthcare is done around the world. Contact the Institute of Applied Energetics right away or visit appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Go deep inside yourself and venture into the realm of the unconscious mind with my Meditating on the Kabbalah guided imagery audio CDs. Discover who you are and what you want in life. Meditating on the Kabbalah can help you to open, clear, and revitalize the energetic pathways of your subtle being. They will support you in your spiritual quest by helping you to access the profound insights and inner guidance you need as you work in alignment with your highest good. Let them help you to release negative thoughts and emotions and clear away any limitations that may keep you from experiencing your full potential. Walk down the path to health, healing, understanding, and enlightenment with Meditating on the Kabbalah. Order your copy today at www.soulhealer.com. Before we get back to the show, I would like to thank all of you for tuning into Just Energy Radio. Many of the people I've helped over the years were listeners just like you. If you're at a junction in your life, don't stand alone at this important time. Call me or send me an email. We can set up a private consultation so that you too can experience health, healing, and wholeness in your life. To find out more about the services I offer, visit www.soulhealer.com.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to the second hour of Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking with Robert Schoch about his new book, Forgotten Civilizations. Just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, we will know in the next week whether Just Energy Radio is moving to a new network. I will put out an announcement about that next week, as well as information on the Just Energy Radio website and anywhere else I can find to post that information. Also, the final copy, the final edit of my new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, went to the printing people. I will be getting a galley copy or a proof copy, hopefully in the next few days, early next week. I don't know. I'm crossing my fingers. I'm really nervous about it. But you can pre-order a copy of it at www.manmadethechronicles.com. We're offering free shipping for all pre-orders, as well as autographs from the authors, and that's priceless. So get your copy today. Also, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. So let's get Robert back on the air so we can continue this fantastic conversation. Robert, you still there?
I'm here.
Yay! Let's turn to Gobekli Tepe, because I have like a whole page of questions.
Okay, that sounds good. No, Gobekli Tepe, yeah.
Okay.
It sounds good. Oh, can I say something about Man-Made Chronicles? I was so pleased you let me read it in, draft form, I guess it was. And, boy, I'm excited about it. So everyone should order that, too. Absolutely.
So I printed your endorsement. Actually, your endorsement is on the webpage, and it's printed inside the book.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. But, yeah, great book. I think all of this ties together so much. And, Gobekli Tepe, I think, ties right in because you've got this very, very early site in southeastern Turkey.
And can you just kind of do a little introduction? Who found it, kind of thing?
Absolutely, because Gobekli Tepe is really important to me and what I've been discussing for so many years, and it's very central to Forgotten Civilization. The book is not, Forgotten Civilization is not just about Gobekli Tepe, but I include a good section on Gobekli Tepe and color photographs of Gobekli Tepe so people who read the book can learn more about it. But it is a site in southeastern Turkey near the border with Syria. I've been there several times to study it extensively. It consists visually, I started to describe it before, but visually it looks like Stonehenge, but think of Stonehenge multiplied by 20-something. There are numerous Stonehenges, if you would, there, but they're not like Stonehenge in the sense that Stonehenge is built from these rough-hewn, sort of chunky stones, big monoliths. At Gobekli Tepe, we have stone circles, and they're made from huge monoliths, but each monolith, each stone, is beautifully carved. They have incredibly beautiful carvings, smooth surfaces. They have animals on them in high relief. They have birds. They have foxes. They have what looks like a feline type organism. Some kind of, people have called it a lion, or people aren't sure exactly what it is. Many of these, some people have suggested that some of these are actually animals that are now extinct, or they're very stylized. There are pigs, there are boars. So it's incredible. It's an incredible site with beautiful carvings. Statues have been found there. What's known as a totem pole, they call it a totem pole in analogy to what people think of as Native American totem poles, but this one is carved out of solid stone. There are anthropomorphic figures. There are little statues of humans that have been found there. So it's a really diverse, incredible site. But the main thing is these big stone enclosures, these big stone circles that have been found there with stones 5 meters or more tall, weighing 10 to 15 tons. And they're very, very thin and wide. So they're not chunky. They're beautifully carved. And there's a lot I could say about, but I want to mention that there's probably astronomical alignments there, very precise astronomical alignments that I have found. It's been suggested that some of the stones may actually have been designed to resonate, vibrate, probably, I believe, as a way to sort of affect consciousness at the site. So it seems to be very, very sophisticated. And what is really important about Gobekli Tepe is the dating of it. If you just saw this site, stylistically, you might say, oh, it's a few thousand years old. It would be incredibly exciting if it were only a few thousand years old. It turns out that no, it goes back 11 to 12,000 years ago, 9 to 10,000 BC, which is thousands of years older than, according to classical historians, classical archaeologists, according to them, civilization begins about 3,000 to 3,500 BC. This is 9 to 10,000 BC, end of the last ice age. So it essentially more than doubles the origins of civilization. It puts civilization back into this very remote period. And Gobekli Tepe was not found until the mid-1990s. A fellow named Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, stumbled upon it. It had actually been discovered, the site. It was known that something ancient was there decades earlier, but people had dismissed it. Archaeologists had dismissed it based on the surface finds as simply maybe Roman or Byzantine. They just saw a few chunks of rock sticking out at the surface. They didn't excavate. They couldn't really tell what was there. And it's a region of the world where there's so many antiquities that, you know, it was just sort of cataloged, okay, here's an archaeological site, but no one was excavating it. Klaus Schmidt came, excavated. He's been meticulous about it. He's only excavated maybe 5% or so of this site so far. It's a huge site. But as I was describing, what he's found is incredible. For me personally, it confirms what I've been saying. I first came out with my redating of the Great Sphinx in the early 1990s, before Gobekli Tepe had been discovered by Klaus Schmidt, before anyone had any concept of what was there. I was saying, based on my work in Egypt, that yes, sophisticated civilization goes back thousands and thousands of years earlier. People asked me, Egyptologists asked me at major conferences as a way to try to dismiss me. Well, if that's the case, where, they put it this way, where are the pottery shards? Where is there evidence of other sophisticated civilization at that very, very remote period in time? And I didn't have a really good answer in the sense that it wasn't satisfying to people. My answer was sort of along the lines, well, when you find the first dinosaur, you find the first evidence of something, there has to be a first. You have to look for more evidence. I mean, I was sure that there would be more evidence. I was sure that my dating was correct geologically. All my geological colleagues confirmed it. But yeah, someone has to be the first. Mm-hmm. If you always threw away the first, there'd never be a second. So this is the second. This, to me, is really the corroborating evidence, the confirming evidence that vindicates me in many ways that, yes, we do have early civilization at that remote period of time.
What I find, let me just throw something in, I find really interesting is that where they have found the quote-unquote origin of agriculture, you know, the Fertile Crescent, you know, the location was 30 kilometers from that site, which totally ties into this whole thing.
Exactly. It ties right in because here we have agriculture originating, all kinds of things. I mean, this seems to be a real key. Talk about place of origination. Many people are familiar with the Bible. Many people are very interested in biblical types of things. We'll put it that way. Gobekli Tepe, to put it in geographic context, and then I'll get to my second point about which is so important to me, but to put it in geographic context, Gobekli Tepe is southeastern Turkey. That doesn't mean a lot to many Americans. Not to put anyone down, but Americans aren't, as a whole, that geographically astute when it comes to certain parts of the world. This is just north of the modern Syrian border, but it is in northern Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. If you go to the Bible, this is Eden. This is the region of Eden in the most northern portion of Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe is very near the city of Şanlıurfa, the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, which historically has been known as Urfa until the last few decades or so, when Şanlıurfa basically means Great Urfa. They sort of renamed it or gave it a more prestigious name. But the historic name of Urfa, the historic city of Urfa, it's also known as Edessa to some people. They might recognize that from the Bible or from ancient times. What's important here is this is a very, very ancient city. Abraham, who really was the founder of Judaism, Christianity, what would ultimately become Christianity, and Islam, they all recognize Abraham as their patriarch. Abraham traditionally was said to have been born in Urfa. When you go to Urfa, you can see what's known as Abraham's Cave, where he was born and he grew up when he was young. There's all kinds of stories of Abraham and a fellow known as Nimrod, who some people attribute the Tower of Babel to. So all kinds of biblical things here, all kinds of ancient history already. And here is Göbekli Tepe. It was discovered in the same area, about half-hour drive from Urfa. So it's a very, very important, very rich historic region, and seems to tie in with all kinds of other, ancient legends, biblical legends, if I could use that term, biblical history. Just a very important region.
And you said you had another
I have
point?
a second point about Göbekli Tepe, which is very important to me, and this ties in. I'm a geologist, and more evidence, and I discussed this in Forgotten Civilization, indicates that the last ice age did not end slowly and gradually. It's not like there was a slow and gradual melting of the glaciers and the climate changed slowly. There's now good evidence developed just in the last few years, based primarily on ice cores, but also other data. But ice cores which record isotopic data, which gives us information on climate change, gives us information, as I was suggesting earlier, on solar activity. There's lots of evidence now that there was a major change in climate at the end of the last ice age, and that climatic change, a huge temperature rise, occurred within just a couple of years, within 3 years or so. But from a geologic perspective, it's really the case that we can say it took at most maybe 3 years. It could have literally happened overnight. We just can't resolve it better than several years in the geologic record. This ties back to Göbekli Tepe. There's evidence that something traumatic, something dramatic, something cataclysmic seems to have been taking place. Göbekli Tepe is this very high advanced civilization, and then it just disappears. The people of Göbekli Tepe disappear. It seems that everything goes into demise, everything falls apart. This early civilization, collapses, if you would, and civilization seems to go underground, maybe both figuratively and literally. I could get into that.
That might be a whole separate show.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of evidence they literally went underground to survive the catastrophes that were occurring. And civilization does not reemerge until thousands and thousands of years later. Getting back to Göbekli Tepe.
But are we talking about the Younger's Dryas event? Or
okay, I'll get to that. Yeah,
okay.
That's something else again. That's something else.
Okay.
Yeah, they all tie together though. So bear with me for a second, since you brought it up. Göbekli Tepe is buried purposefully and intentionally. So it's this great civilization, evidence of a great civilization. There seems to be something's happening. I think it's major catastrophe, in a literal sense. It has to do with earth changes at the end of the last ice age. I believe that the Gobekli Tepe people were trying to struggle with it. You know, things were happening. The world was literally collapsing around them. There were major solar outbursts. There were earthquakes. There was volcanic activity. All this would be induced by solar outbursts, which would melt glaciers really, really quickly, release pressure on the crust of the earth, cause volcanic activity, cause earthquakes. We even see that in Iceland now due to global warming. The glaciers are melting so quickly that earthquakes are occurring much more rapidly. Volcanic activity is much higher than it was even a few hundred years ago. That's a side note. What happens at Gobekli Tepe is really unusual. In most cases, an archaeological site is abandoned, and ancient city is abandoned. Ancient monuments are abandoned. Then they sort of fall over. They get covered in with sediment. We talked about this for Easter Island. And then archaeologists thousands of years later come and excavate them. This is not what happened at Gobekli Tepe. The people actually re-erected some of the monuments. They seem to have tried to put everything into order. Then they purposefully covered it over. They literally built a mountain over it, an artificial small mountain to cover it, I believe, to protect it, to try to protect it, to try to preserve it. Maybe they thought, well, after these catastrophes are over, they could come back and re-excavate it. Maybe they simply wanted to leave it for posterity, leave it for us to find years later to serve in code information, serve like a hall of records. But something's going on there, and I think it ties in with this bigger picture of these early civilizations facing a huge catastrophe, going into decline, essentially disappearing, going into a dark age, and only the civilization reemerge thousands and thousands of years later.
It does make me laugh when you listen to some historians, researchers, whoever they are, that talk about, the end of the Ice Age and the flood. They like to throw that one in.
Yeah.
But then, it's like, okay. But when you start really looking at the research or the data that they then turn around and say, it's like, well, water levels rose like 1 meter a year or some nominal amount. And it's like, well, I don't think a meter a year makes a flood.
No. And that ties in, actually, that ties in with what you just mentioned, the Younger Dryas. So let me mention the Younger Dryas.
Okay.
The Younger Dryas is a time period at the very end of the last ice age, and ties in with what I was just talking about, ties in with Gobekli Tepe. The ice age was a time of cold, global cooler temperatures. There was not literally ice all over the earth, but ice in the northern hemisphere extended to much lower latitudes than it does now. The ice age slowly was coming to an end. It lasted for the last ice age, 100,000 years or whatever. It was slowly coming to an end in the sense that slowly temperatures were gradually warming up. They're gradually warming up. Then at about 10,900 BC, and I'm using the best dates that I believe in geologically based on the evidence, about 10,900 BC, geologically speaking, there is a cold snap. It gets colder suddenly, relatively suddenly at 10,900 BC. That is known as the beginning of the Younger Dryas. So it was starting to warm up, then you have a cold snap. And there's a lot of evidence, and people have probably heard about this, that there may have been a comet that exploded in the atmosphere or maybe hit Earth in northern latitudes. Some people suggest over northern North America, that would have thrown dust into the atmosphere, would have had various effects that could cause a cold snap. But whatever was happening, there was a cold snap that began about 10,900 BC. That's the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And people sometimes ask me, well, why is it called the Younger Dryas? What does that mean? Dryas is actually a little alpine flower, which which does very well under colder temperatures. So you get these flowers flourishing during the younger Dryas.
Well, that was a nice little tidbit of information.
Yeah.
I thought it was named after somebody.
No, it's actually named after a flower, and you still find them. It's still alive, but geologically you find their pollen, and their pollen spreads as it gets colder and spreads to lower latitudes. So the younger Dryas is 10,900 BC. It goes on for about 1,200 years or so, and then it ends very suddenly, very dramatically, 9,700 BC, and that is the, quote, official end of the last ice age. And that is where you have this dramatic warming over just a few years, maybe literally overnight. At that point, I believe that all the evidence indicates there was a major, major solar outburst, as I was mentioning, that would cause the climate to go up very dramatically, temperatures to rise incredibly dramatically. It would melt glaciers like, nobody's business very, very quickly. A major solar outburst. You could actually think in some regions these plasma discharges would hit the Earth, literally hit the Earth, may have caused what was known as vitrification. Even nowadays, when you get really powerful bolts of lightning hitting Earth, in some cases it can, in certain spots, melt the surface rock, and then it resolidifies in what is known as vitrification. We have evidence of that occurring at the end of the last ice age. When there was this major solar outburst, you would have, in some cases, evaporated huge amounts of water. This would go into the atmosphere. It would change the climate, but it would also have to precipitate out. So you would get these torrential rains. I think that could tie in, frankly, with the incredible erosion that we have on the Sphinx, that would tie in, I believe, with flood stories around the world where you have torrential rains. It's not just a matter of, as you said, sea levels rising a meter, a century or something. And it ties in with a lot of things. It also ties in, I believe, with many stories around the world, many legends. And when I say legends, I take them seriously, of people going underground to escape the catastrophe. So I think it all ties in at this point, this theory of a major solar outburst and the evidence for it at the end of the last ice age, wiping out major civilizations.
But is there really evidence? When I was researching my book, and I'm just going to ask you because you're a geologist and you should know this stuff.
Yeah.
I went digging around to look for some kind of geological evidence, proof, smoking gun of when the flood happened, and that's what I was finding is, water levels were rising,
water
and
levels,
it's like, give me a break.
No. Water levels were rising, and that happens at the end of the last ice age. But what you're talking about is sea level rises.
Well, no, but I'm talking about, because there is legends of a flood on every continent around the world.
And I think that what people have been looking at is really the wrong area. A lot of people have tied this in with sea level rises and that somehow causes the floods, etc. I'm not dismissing that. I mean, certainly you had sea level rises at the end of the last ice age. Between 18,000 BC, really at the height of the last ice age in terms of climate, in terms of glacial changes, glacial buildup, and the very end of the last ice age, 9,700 BC, you have glaciers melting, you have sea levels rising as much as 100 meters or so along coastlines. So that's major. In major areas of the world were inundated. But that's very different than what I'm talking about, which is at the very end of the last ice age, you had torrential rains because of the factors I was mentioning, and this would have caused incredible flash flooding. Incredible, when you have huge downpours over a very short period of time, this causes locally major, major flooding, and I believe this was essentially synchronous around the world. These were climatic changes. These were solar events that were happening around the world at the same time. So I think what we have recorded in many of the flood legends that have been passed down to us may be a combination of things. But I certainly think one aspect was the situation that you had at the end of the last ice age. I wanted to mention, did we talk about Plato, Atlantis?
No, but I have plenty other questions.
Okay. I just wanted to mention really quickly that Plato's Atlantis, I think, ties in here, not his descriptions of Atlantis, that type of thing, but his dating of Atlantis, which has been very, very controversial. And it turns out if you study Plato and you look at his dating and you take his dating on face value and you interpret it in the calendar that we use, more or less the AD and BC, he dates the end of Atlantis with the cataclysms, the changes, the flooding, etc., to 9600 BC, more or less, which I think is incredibly similar to, coincidental with the 9700 BC for the end of the last ice age, based on the best recent geological data, looking at ice cores, looking at sediment cores, and where these major changes occur. So I don't think that, I find it hard to believe his dating, from thousands of years ago, Plato lived in the 4th century BC, that he would just happen to have hit upon the same date as we find with modern science is the end of the last ice age.
Well, and, you bring an interesting point to the table regarding the flood legend. I think most people have this image of a tsunami-like event as opposed to this overwhelming, downpours that created some other kind of issue. Exactly.
That's exactly it. I think people have been thinking in the wrong terms in a way.
I mean, because I was looking for, things along the coastline that would show, water going up on the land.
Exactly.
But they're not. You would think there would be a hard fingerprint for it, and they're not finding that.
There's not. But I think that's what I was saying. I think people have been looking the wrong way. I think it was really these torrential rains coming down. I now think we have evidence and a mechanism for why that was occurring.
Cool. I'm going to have to put that in my little thinking cap.
Yeah. It's good to think about all these things. It's amazing just having a discussion like this, what it makes us both think about it. Yeah.
But let's turn our attention back to Gobekli Tepe. I have to tell you, so I actually saw a special on Discovery Channel, one of them, National, Smithsonian, one of them, about that site. I was shocked.
Yeah, I don't think
shocked.
I've seen it, yeah.
Well, they probably aired it once and went, they got to take that off.
Yeah.
But one of the things that made me laugh, and I would like to ask you, is the monolithic columns that are in there. They inferred that they were sandstone or limestone. And they're
limestone.
Okay. Because they had this guy, and he, carved, an image of a boar on a piece of limestone. He goes, well, this only took me 3 hours to do, and blah, blah, blah. Look how simple this is. It's easy. I mean, that was their inference. Well, it's easy. But they didn't ever say what the material was that the columns were. And, my thought is, yeah, but they're probably granite, and you're carving into a piece of limestone.
Well, I didn't see that show, so I don't know what he was doing. And I will say that
they were doing, showing how they could possibly have, with some primitive rock tool, carved those pillars.
What scale was he using? I mean, how big was the thing he was carving? I'm just curious.
I'm just kind of throwing this out there, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet. He was just carving an image of a boar onto.
That's not even comparable. I mean, these things are huge. Number one, they are limestone. They're very hard, compact limestone. To cut these things out, I mean, the quarries are not very far from the site.
Well, and he wasn't talking about the whole monolith. He was just talking about the carving on the side.
Right. But see, what you have to remember is that these are monoliths. They're huge, and they have carvings in relief on them. They're not incised in. They're carvings in relief. So to get that carving, say when you carve that boar on it, in relief, you have to demarcate where that boar is going to be. You have to carve down that boar, carve in that boar. Then you have to carve the rest of the stone for the entire monolith away from it. Am I being clear?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that it sticks out. It's very different than if you were incising it in. And you have to do that on the monoliths. They're doing this in some cases on both sides of it. I mean, these are very sophisticated carvings in many cases. They're also using very large slabs of limestone, which are standing numerous meters tall, but they're very thin relative to their height and the third dimension. We'll call it their length, if you would, their width one way versus their width the other way. So you have to be able to carve these things. You have to be able to erect them without cracking them, without breaking them. I mean, I don't think there's anything unsophisticated or easy about this at all when I look at them, and I've dealt a lot with stone and stonework. It's one thing to take a little block of limestone. You don't know what kind of limestone he's looking at. It could be
it looked pretty soft.
It could be soft. There are limestones that are incredibly soft that you can carve really easily, especially when you're just talking a little 3 by 3 foot block or whatever, versus there are other limestones that are incredibly difficult to carve. I would say, frankly, the Gobekli Tepe ones are on the more difficult side from what I've been able to see, having visited several times the site, and not only the difficulty of the limestone, but the size of them, to keep that concerted effort up to carve the entire surface properly without making any mistakes, because if you make a mistake, you can't repair it, you can't change it. And to erect them without cracking them, without breaking them, this is not an easy task when it comes right down to it. And it actually makes me sort of upset when some people do that. They say, oh, this is so easy to do with primitive tools. It's putting the people down. I want to mention something else at Gobekli Tepe because it ties in here. Not only do you have the huge monolithic monuments there, these huge pillars, but you also have, for instance, on the other end of the scale, you have little teeny beads that are made out of obsidian, made out of other very hard volcanic stones, and these are incredibly small beads. We saw on site when Katie and I were there the first time, for instance, a little rectangular bead as big as your thumb or so, yet it was drilled through perfectly along the long axis, incredibly thin bead drilled through along the long axis, a little teeny hole, maybe a millimeter or two in diameter, perfectly through it. This is a bead from 11,000, 12,000 years ago when they didn't have any, supposedly had no no metal working. How would you do that with, quote, primitive stone tools to drill a little teeny hole through a bead that's a centimeter or more long along its long axis? I mean, you're not... Yeah, so there was a technology
It's a miracle.
there. Yeah, it's a technology that we don't know. They found in Turkey, not at Gobekli Tepe, but elsewhere, they found in Turkey not that long ago a bracelet made out of obsidian. And this bracelet is, on the order of 7,000-8,000 years old.
Wow.
And it's made out of obsidian, and they analyzed it, with the best microscopes, electron microscopes or whatever, and they found that the finish on it, the polish on it, the perfection of how it was done. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. Perfect circle, perfect little angles on it. They were comparing it to the best grinding of glass and lenses for optics that we have today, because it was made out of obsidian, which is a natural glass. And
wow,
to put this stuff down and say that they're all a bunch of primitives, I don't think cuts it.
All right, I want to go back to the monoliths because I have a burning question. Where were the quarries for these stones? And is there wood in the area that they could make rollers with to roll them into place? And please, sarcasm included.
Well, no. Actually, the issue of the quarries and that type of thing, I don't see as a big problem in terms of Gobekli Tepe. The quarries there are some quarries there that I'm trying to guesstimate. I mean, they're certainly within a kilometer or so, where they could be carving this. Also, Gobekli Tepe right now, it's a very arid sort of desert region. But when it was at its height, at the end of the last ice age, it was much more lush. There was much more plant life, animal life, that type of thing. I don't know about rollers and wood and that type of thing. That sort of, I think, almost goes back to a 1950s movie or something. I'm not saying that.
Well, that's why I was saying, sarcasm.
Yeah. And that's how people a lot of times visualize that. What I think we have to realize is that the Gobekli Tepe people, or any of these people, would have had a quite sophisticated material technology that we have absolutely no record of, no indication of. All of it's been lost. For instance, what materials did they have in terms of ropes, in terms of nets, in terms of fabrics, that type of thing? I could easily see a much better way to transport some of these columns is not on rollers, which would damage the surfaces, damage the finish, could easily cause them to crack. But, maybe you put them on some kind of big netting type of surface, some kind of big tarp, or, with ropes, and you have a bunch of people, holding it that way, if people could visualize that. I'm just throwing this out. I mean, we just don't know what the technology was. We don't know exactly how they were doing it. But they clearly did it, and I like to make the point that clearly they had a very sophisticated technology, because we see the results of that, namely the erected stone pillars, and they did it somehow.
When we were talking about the Moai, you said, well, everybody talks about the statue, and I look at the geology. And when we talk about Gobekli Tepe, everybody talks about the pillars, and no one talks about the circular structures that they actually are enclosed in. And do you have any comments about that? And I have a couple of questions.
Now, when you talk about the circular structures, they're sort of like wall-type structures.
Right.
That
That's
they're
what
enclosed
I'm
in.
talking about.
And I do have a comment about that. I believe what we have at Gobekli Tepe is several different, we'll say, periods of use and occupation. I believe that the evidence indicates that initially the pillars were erected, that they were freestanding pillars. So you had a circle of pillars, you have pairs of pillars inside that circle. These are all astronomically aligned. I've done some work researching that firsthand. So I believe you had freestanding pillars. Some of these pillars were very sophisticated in the way they were set into the bedrock. They were actually using what's been described as a concrete, and a concrete long before concrete is supposed to have been discovered. They're set into the bedrock. As I mentioned briefly before, I think some of them may have even been allowed to vibrate. They were purposely vibrating, sort of like big tuning forks. Then later, catastrophes started to occur. Later, there was this huge cataclysm. There's indications that some of them actually got knocked over, some of them fell over. At that point, these stone circles, I believe, were erected. These walls, which sort of connect the pillars, some of the pillars were re-erected. You can see that in one of the photographs in the color insert in my book. The pillar was actually re-erected. The stone walls were built up against the pillars. They even covered over some of the reliefs. Clearly, these reliefs were meant to be seen initially. The walls abut against them. The walls are actually more primitive in construction than the pillars themselves. So I think you have a second generation, if you would, or a second usage of them when you have this cataclysm. It's almost, and I use this as a general sense, general term, but not jokingly, it's almost as if they're going from having a very sophisticated structure that's freestanding to now fortifying it, turning into sort of a fallout shelter or a bunker. And they do that, and then they cover the entire structure over completely, as I mentioned before, with tons and tons and tons of soil and debris to protect it. So, as I mentioned before, they sort of re-erected it. They put things into position. They built those retaining walls, if you would, around it, those circular structures. Then they covered it over. And I think it's sort of false or a misconstruction. I have seen in, for instance, National Geographic did an article, and they show pictures of Gobekli Tepe with the circular walls and the pillars are sticking up between them. I don't think that is how it was originally. I think those pillars were freestanding. The walls were not there. They're put in secondarily. Then the whole thing is covered over. And again, I believe this ties in very cogently with the concept that there were these major cataclysms, this major catastrophe, these major solar outbursts, and they were doing what they could to sort of repair it, if you would, and then cover it over quickly to protect it and preserve it.
And the reason I was asking about those walls, and I'll use some of the things we've talked about so far. On Easter Island, we see some of that cyclopean architecture like we find in South America. And you also find that in the Temple of the Sphinx.
Absolutely.
You know, and my curiosity was, do you also find that kind of building construction in those circles? But my thought was that it was all built at the same time and not even secondary.
No. You don't find it in those circles, at least not the ones that have been excavated so far. Remember, there's, 18 or 20 more circles to be excavated in the Gobekli Tepe region, in the site. So we don't have all the data yet. It's going to take decades to excavate it all. But no, you don't have the same type of megalithic, huge blocks in those circles. But again, I think that ties in because that was not a primary structure. That was a secondary structure that was being erected to sort of protect it, to put things, to hold pillars into place that had fallen over, and then everything was covered over. So it was not sort of, at that point, a finished structure. It was a finished structure initially, but those walls were not meant to be a finely finished structure. They were, I think, put up in relative haste under, less than ideal conditions, cataclysmic conditions.
How large would you say the whole complex is? And please use feet or miles as opposed to kilometers, because I don't think anybody can.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There's, I think in terms of kilometers.
I know.
So it's just
about, about.
Oh, I have to estimate. I mean, it covers. Let's use acres. People sort of have a concept of acres. It covers dozens of acres. It covers dozens and dozens of acres.
So bigger than multiple football fields.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty huge.
It's an overall huge site, and in the Gobekli Tepe area, when you look out from Gobekli Tepe, you can see other artificial mounds, other artificial hills that probably cover sites like it. So there's more there. There's an incredible amount there, it turns out. It I think may have been a real sort of center of this very, very early civilization, and it's going to be very exciting. I mean, I'd like to fast forward, a few decades from now and see how much has been uncovered and how much we know at that point. But we're talking a huge site. So, and just to get back, if people didn't know what a kilometer was when I was talking about the quarries, they're maybe 3/4 of a mile or something at most, somewhere in there, 2/3 of a mile.
Mm-hmm.
So not real far away.
But it's still a big,
heavy
stone
big,
that you
heavy
have
thing.
to move.
Yeah, you don't want to underestimate what it's like to walk even half a mile or 3/4 of a mile with a huge megalith like that. And you're not only trying to transport it, but you're trying to transport it. You don't want to chip the surface. You don't want to crack it. You don't want to break it. Some of them, just like the Moai, they're ones that broke in the quarry. Or in Egypt, you have obelisks that they were carving, this incredible obelisk, and then it cracks.
Mm-hmm.
and there's nothing you can do about it at that point. That's one of the things too. People don't realize that sometimes in modern times. Building with megalithic stone has its disadvantages. It has, when you break one, in some cases you can't do anything about it. You just have to toss it. You have to start over again.
My husband and I often joke around about, like some of the obelisks in Egypt or any of the carvings in Egypt, just as a general idea, it's like, well, what if someone had a typo?
I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you ruined the whole thing. You can't.
There isn't any whiteout.
Yeah, you can't use whiteout on obelisk.
Delete. A different question. You're familiar with Christopher Dunn's work?
Oh, you sure? I know Christopher Dunn.
Okay, one of the things that he looks at is the level of technology used and the precision of the carving. And
right.
You comment about you talked about the monoliths themselves, but the carvings?
The carving is, okay, Chris Dunn's work has been primarily Egypt, although he's been working in South America and whatnot.
I was just trying to give you an idea of where I was going.
Yeah, and he has found that in Egypt, for instance, you have incredibly sophisticated, on a micro level carving. You have that, I think, at Gobekli Tepe too, but like many craftsmen, you only need to use that level of sophistication when you need it. You don't necessarily need that to carve a stone pillar, although I'm not saying it's not there, because when I look at this stuff, it looks very sophisticated to me. It looks like they were using very fine techniques for carving, but I think applicable here is what I mentioned before. When you have, for instance, a stone beadwork, you're talking the same level of fine carving, fine sophistication, as I believe people like Chris Dunn in particular, have been finding elsewhere in the world. Yet, again, I want to point out that Gobekli Tepe, we're talking 9 to 10,000 BC. We're not talking 1,500 BC, as we have for the height of some of the Egyptian material. And 3,500 years ago, for them to be doing such sophisticated work is incredible. But when you go back 10,000 BC, that is 11 to 12,000 years ago, and you still see comparable sophistication, I'll put it that way. That it's so out of place compared to what standard archaeologists have been talking about, standard historians have been talking about. That's one reason that many of them, they can't deny Gobekli Tepe at this point. It's being excavated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. It is, he does impeccable work. It clearly dates back to that time period. He's got all kinds of good data, stratigraphic data, radiocarbon data, etc., but it just changes everything. It really means we have to rewrite all of our history when it comes to the origins of civilization, when it comes to our thinking about where did civilization originate, how did humans, sophisticated, we'll call it, culture originate? We just really have to rewrite everything. And the problem, of course, for many people, if you're a professional historian, a professional archaeologist, you don't want to have to all of a sudden change all of your thinking and all your preconceptions and your entire worldview. That makes people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. One last question we have, I'm going to say 3 minutes. 30 minutes. Was that site ever habitated?
People are arguing about this. Gobekli Tepe?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, the standard view, and when I say the standard view, this is really from Klaus Schmidt, is that it was not a habitation site, that it was not a living site. It's not where people were living, that type of thing. He sees it, and I don't like the term at all, he sees it as the world's first temple, as he sometimes calls it. I think it's more sophisticated, or that sort of does it a disservice to call it just a temple. But it was clearly a very important site. It probably a religious site, probably an astronomical site. One thing I wanted to point out, that even as recently as a few hundred years ago, the distinction between religion, science, philosophy, etc., we did not have such clear boundaries. And certainly back then, I don't think there were clear boundaries. I actually think of it sometimes as more like a university, a very ancient university that tied to the skies, tied to astronomy, tied to the science of the time. So people argue about that. What you have to remember, however, is that it's a huge site. Most of it has not been excavated. 90% of it hasn't been excavated. So, maybe more gets excavated and we find that, oh yeah, there were dormitories down the street, so to speak, where they were living. We just don't know at this point. But looking at it, I think there's very strong astronomical, which really means astrological connections, because people back then, why were they observing the sky? We know from more recent ancient history it really had to do with what now we call astrology, which I believe has really been demoted in modern times. People poo-poo it. It's become sort of the newspaper astrology, I'll call it, which is not what astrology really was. It really had to do with understanding the cosmos, understanding the connections between humans and the sky, the bigger world, the universe. I talk about this somewhat in Forgotten Civilization also.
Robert, we need to kind of transition here. One last reminder for the listeners about your book, about your 2 upcoming events that you have.
Absolutely. Forgotten Civilization, the role of solar outbursts in our past and future. And people should go to my website, Robert Schoch, RobertSchoch.com. They'll find on the right side of the front page a picture of the cover of the book. The book cover, I'm very proud to say, was designed by Katie, my wife. And they can click on that. It will take them to a link on Amazon to buy the book. On the left side of the front page of the website, my website, they will see little tabs, little posters they can click on for either the Egypt tour we talked about in December or the tour to Easter Island in November. So I'm very excited about all of these, and I hope people will consider them.
And if you go to Easter Island, you get to hang out with Brian Forster, our good friend, and Hugh Newman.
That's true. That's true.
You can learn about elongated heads and all kinds of crazy things.
It's going to be a great trip. They're both going to be great trips. It's going to be wonderful to be on Easter Island in November, and I'm very excited about being in Egypt in December for the solstice, the winter solstice, and New Year's and Christmas. So.
And the end of the world on December 21st, 2012.
What better place to be? What better place to be?
Yeah, no kidding. Robert, wonderful conversation. I always love having you on. You just are a plethora of information. And this new book, I said before, we came on air, I got to read through part of it, but it's just jam-packed with stuff. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Robert. I will talk to you later.
Okay, sounds good.
And next week, we're going to be having Steve Wasserman on talking about the memoir of the occult, and Norman D. Ellis talking about imagining the world into existence. So until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember, it's all just energy.